My name is Peter Marsden, and I need you to understand something before this story goes any further. I am not a man who loses his temper. I never have been. 60 years of living through a marriage that nearly broke me, through raising a daughter alone, through burying people I loved, and I have never once flipped a table, raised my voice in anger, or made a scene in public. My father used to say, "A man who controls his reaction controls the room." I believed him then. I believe him more now, because the day my son-in-law stood in my daughter's kitchen and gave me 48 hours to clear out, the day he looked me in the eye at her funeral repast and told me to pack my things, I did not raise my voice. I nodded. I smiled, and I went to find a phone. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge, where every secret has a price, every betrayal has a consequence, and justice always finds its way home. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and drop a comment below. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because in this family, you never want to miss what happens next. Kara's service was held on a Friday morning at Calvary Baptist on Morrison Street. White lilies everywhere. Because Kara had always said roses at funerals were too obvious, too expected. She told me that once, laughing over sweet tea on my back porch when she was 34 years old. The way young people laugh about death, like it's a fascinating concept that has absolutely nothing to do with them personally. She was 37 when I had to remember it. The church was full. Kara was the kind of person who collected people without trying. Co-workers, neighbors, old college friends who drove hours just to be there. They filled those pews, and they cried and they sang and they said her name like it was something sacred. I sat in the front row in a dark suit, the one Kara had picked out for me 2 Christmases ago. "Dad, you need one good suit that actually fits," she'd said, dragging me into the store like I was 16. I'd complained the entire time. I'd worn it with pride ever since. I held my brother Raymond's hand so tightly he lost feeling in 3 fingers and didn't say a word about it. And right beside me, in the very next seat, sat Joel Pruitt, my son-in-law, crying. Now, I want to be very careful about how I say this next part, because I need you to understand it completely. Joel Pruitt cried the way certain men cry in public when they need people to see them crying. Just loud enough to be noticed, just quiet enough to seem restrained. Handkerchief out. Head bowed at the right moments, but it was the handkerchief that got me. I had never once seen Joel Pruitt use a handkerchief in 5 years. Not at their wedding, not at any dinner, any holiday, any occasion that might have warranted one. It was pressed, perfectly pressed, the kind of thing you prepare the night before. He had ironed a handkerchief for his wife's funeral. I filed that away. Then there was the shoulder touch. At 3 separate points during the service, I counted because something in me was already counting. Joel reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder. Firm, warm, timed precisely to moments of visible emotion from the congregation. Not when I was struggling, when other people were, when the camera of everyone's attention was briefly, collectively pointed in our direction. 3 times. Like punctuation. And the last time he did it, during the final hymn, when half the church had dissolved completely. I felt his hand settle on my shoulder, and I looked at him from the corner of my eye. His face was arranged in grief, every feature in its correct position. Eyes wet, jaw slightly tightened, the full composition. But his eyes were scanning the room, just for a moment, just a single sweep across the congregation, the faces, the flowers, the casket, the officiant, like a man taking inventory of a room he intended to own. Then he felt me watching. His eyes came back to the casket immediately, and something moved across his face that I can only describe as a recalibration, a barely visible adjustment, the way a performer makes when they realize someone in the audience saw them check their phone. I looked back at the front of the church. I did not file that one away. I kept it right at the surface where I could feel it. The repast was at the house. Kara's house, the one she and Joel had bought 3 years ago on Delmore Avenue. Cream-colored shutters. A garden out back that she'd built from bare dirt, weekend by weekend, like it was her private cathedral. I moved through the rooms accepting casseroles and condolences. Raymond stayed close, topping off my water glass, steering well-meaning people away when he saw my jaw tighten. 40 years of brotherhood means someone knows your warning signs without being told. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the rooms began to thin, and that was when Joel found me. I was standing in Kara's kitchen looking at the herbs she'd planted on the windowsill. Basil, rosemary, mint, little labeled pots in her handwriting. I was just looking at them, thinking about who was going to water them now. Joel came and stood beside me. He loosened his tie. He looked out the window at the garden, and after a moment, in the measured voice of a man who had rehearsed this, he said, "Peter, I've been thinking about the house." I kept looking at the herbs. I said, "Have you?" Not a question. Just 2 words I needed to say while I arranged my face. He said, "This is my home, mine and Kara's, and I think it would be best if you and Raymond made other arrangements. I need my space to grieve." I turned and looked at him then. He had the absolute audacity to look sympathetic. He said, "I think 48 hours is reasonable to get your things together. Now, here is what I need you to understand about me. I raised a child alone. I buried my parents and 2 of my closest friends. I survived a marriage that cost me more than I ever talk about, and a secret I kept for 30 years that cost me even more than that. I have stood in rooms where everything was falling apart, and never once let them see me flinch. So when Joel Pruitt stood in my dead daughter's kitchen and gave me 48 hours, I nodded. I said, "Of course, Joel, that's completely reasonable." And I watched something move across his face. Relief, which told me everything. He'd expected a fight. I gave him a smile instead. And I went to find my brother. Raymond was in the hallway outside the guest room stacking empty dishes. I touched his arm. He looked at my face. He said, "What happened?" Not a question. Raymond has known my faces since 1979. I pulled him into the guest room and closed the door. I told him exactly what Joel had said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man deciding between several responses and carefully selecting the one least likely to result in a criminal charge. Then Raymond said, "He said that today." I said, "He did." He said, "At his wife's repast." I said, "While the food was still warm." He closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and said, "Peter, what are you going to do? And here is where I need you to lean in. Because what I said next wasn't about Joel Pruitt at all. It was about a secret. One that had been sitting at the bottom of my chest like a stone at the bottom of a river, heavy, still, patient, for 30 years. I said, "Raymond, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to say a single word until I am completely finished." He sat down on the edge of the guest bed. I sat across from him, and for the first time in 3 decades, I let it out. Her name was Diana Greer. I met her in the spring of 1993. I was 29 years old. She was the daughter of Edmund Greer, old money, the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Diana and I were together for 8 months. It was real. It was serious. And it was, for reasons I am not proud of, a secret. Because Edmund Greer had very particular ideas about who his daughter brought home. And I was a 29-year-old man from the South Side with student loans and a second-hand couch who did not come from the kind of family Edmund Greer considered acceptable. I knew what the situation was. I told myself I could outlast it. When Diana told me she was pregnant, I sat with it for a week, then I went to Edmund Greer directly, man to man. He offered me money, not a conversation, not respect, not even a real look in the eye. Money. I looked at him across that office and felt something harden inside me that has never fully softened. I thanked him. I stood up. I walked out. I never contacted either of them again. I met my wife Renee a year later. We had Kara together. When Kara was 4, Renee left. Not because of Edmund or Diana or any of it. Just because some marriages quietly stop working, and 2 people who were once right for each other become wrong. We stayed kind. We stayed parents. But Kara grew up with me, mostly, and I raised her the best I knew how. I never told Kara about Diana. I told myself it wasn't relevant, that it was ancient history, that some doors once closed should stay that way. I was wrong about that. 6 months ago, Kara called me. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Raymond hadn't moved. He was sitting completely still, both hands on his knees. I said, "She found her, Raymond. I don't know how, but Kara found Diana Greer." Raymond's eyes widened. I said, "One of those DNA ancestry tests. A half-sibling match she'd never heard of." She pulled that thread until she found the whole picture. Diana. Edmund. All of it. Raymond said, quietly, "Did she confront you?" I said, "She gave me a chance to explain. I told her everything." She cried. I cried. We didn't speak for 3 weeks. My voice held. Barely. And then she called me back. She said, "Dad, I understand. And I need you to know I've already made contact with him." Raymond went still. I said, "Edmund Greer is 71 years old, never married, no other children. And when Kara walked into his life 6 months ago, I stopped, looked at my hands. He changed his will. 3 months ago, Kara stands to inherit everything." The guest room went so quiet I could hear the kitchen faucet dripping down the hall. Then Raymond said just 2 words. "And Joel." I looked at him. He said, "Did Joel know?" And that right there was the question that had been sitting at the bottom of that river. Heavy, still, patient. I said, "That is exactly what I intend to find out. Because my daughter had found her family, and 3 months later she was dead. And I had spent 30 years keeping a secret that someone had just turned into a motive. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely." I didn't sleep that night, not 1 hour. I lay in Raymond's guest room staring at the ceiling, assembling everything I knew about Joel Pruitt the way you assemble a case. Not from the conclusion backward, but piece by piece, turning each one over slowly, looking at the shape of it. Joel Pruitt, 41 years old, financial consultant, which sounded impressive until you understood that Joel's brand of financial consulting meant telling other people how to manage money he himself did not have. He and Kara had met at a conference in Atlanta 5 years ago. He was charming in the way certain men are charming, automatically, effortlessly, like breathing. Kara had called me after their third date and said, "Dad, I think he might be the one." I said, "What does he do again?" She said, "Financial consulting." I said, "It means I'd like to meet him." I met him 2 weeks later over Sunday dinner. He complimented my cooking twice. He asked thoughtful questions. He laughed at the right moments. He was good. But the whole evening behind those easy smiles, I kept catching something in Joel's eyes when he looked around Kara's apartment. I couldn't name it then. A calculation. And lying there in Raymond's guest room in the dark, I kept coming back to something I had not allowed myself to think about directly all day. That room scan at the funeral. That single sweep of his eyes across the congregation, while his hand was on my shoulder and his face was arranged in grief. A man who loved his wife does not scan the room at her funeral. A man who loved his wife does not iron a handkerchief the night before. A man who loved his wife does not give her father 48 hours while the food from her repast is still warm. I lay there and I thought about Kara, in the garden center, asking about tomatoes and peppers, laughing at her own indecision. And I thought about Joel Pruitt's eyes moving across that church like he was counting the chairs. And I thought, she knew. I didn't know how I knew that yet, but I knew she knew. The morning after the repast, I called Kara's best friend, a man named Damien, sharp, direct, no nonsense. The kind of friend who loves you without needing anything back. Kara had known him since college. I'd always liked Damien because he told Kara the truth even when she didn't want to hear it. That's rare. He picked up before the second ring. He said, "Peter, I've been waiting for you to call." Those words. The way he said them, not surprised, not just grieving, but waiting, like he'd been sitting by that phone knowing this call was coming, and dreading what came after it. I said, "Tell me." He said, "Not on the phone. Can you come to me?" I was at his door in 40 minutes. Damien had coffee ready. He didn't offer pleasantries. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He sat across from me at his kitchen table and looked at me the way a man looks at someone he's about to hurt for their own good, with care and without hesitation. He said, "How much do you know?" I said, "About which part?" He said, "Edmund Greer." I said, "Kara found him. They made contact. He changed his will." Damien nodded. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at it for a moment, before he looked back up at me. He said, "Did Kara tell you she hired an attorney?" I went completely still. He said, "About 2 months ago, she came to me scared, Peter." He stopped there. Let the word scared sit in the room between us for a full moment before he continued. Not scared of Edmund. She liked him. She said he was gentle and quiet, and spent their first meeting just looking at her face like he was trying to memorize 6 months of missed time all at once. My chest tightened. I said nothing. She was scared of Joel. She'd found something on his laptop. Financial, she didn't tell me exactly what, but she said it felt wrong, very wrong. Damien paused again, And then she said his behavior had shifted. Subtle things at first. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. The questions he started asking about her schedule that had no obvious reason behind them. A phone call she overheard from the hallway, and when she walked into the room, he ended it. Just like that. Mid-sentence. I said, "And the attorney?" Damien stood up, opened a kitchen drawer, pulled out a business card. He held it for a moment before he slid it across the table, like he was giving me something he wished he didn't have to give. I looked at it. Harrison Wolfe. Estate and probate law. I said, "This is Edmund Greer's attorney." Damien looked at me carefully. Kara contacted him directly. She wanted to understand exactly what inheriting Edmund's estate meant, what her rights were. He paused. And she wanted to make sure that whatever she inherited, Joel could never touch. I sat with that for a moment. The coffee, the kitchen, the business card on the table between us. My daughter, 37 years old, smart and careful and full of white lilies and labeled herb pots, had been living with a man she was quietly, methodically building a case against. And she hadn't told me. She hadn't told me because she knew, the way daughters know their fathers, that I would have driven to that house on Delmore Avenue and made a scene that would have warned Joel before Kara was ready. She was protecting me, even then, even scared. She was still protecting her old man. I picked up the business card. I turned it over in my fingers once. Then I put it in my jacket pocket, stood up, and shook Damien's hand. He held it a beat longer than a handshake requires. He said, "Get him, Peter." I said, "I intend to." I called Harrison Wolfe from Damien's driveway. I sat in my car for a moment first. Just a moment. The street was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere 2 blocks over. The sky was that particular pale gray of a morning that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. I thought about Kara finding that business card, sitting in this same city, in some parking lot or driveway, working up the courage to make a phone call she should never have had to make. Then I dialed. Harrison Wolfe answered on the 3rd ring. Measured. Professional. When I said my name, he paused for exactly 1 second. In that second, I heard recognition. He said, "Mr. Marsden, I wondered when you'd reach out." I said, "How much did my daughter tell you about me?" He said, "Enough that I'm not surprised you found me within 48 hours of the funeral." I said, "Mr. Wolfe, I need to know everything." He said, "Come in. There are things better discussed in person." And Mr. Marsden, a pause brief and deliberate, "Bring your brother if you'd like. What I'm going to show you, you won't want to be alone for it." I picked up Raymond on the way. Harrison Wolfe's office was downtown, 12th floor. The kind of office that tells you quietly and firmly that the man inside it is exceptionally good at what he does. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s. Calm eyes, the deliberate manner of someone who delivered life-altering information regularly and had learned exactly how to do it without flinching. He shook my hand, shook Raymond's, gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Then he opened a folder. He did not open it immediately. He set it on the desk in front of him and rested his hands on top of it for just a moment. the way a man does when he is making sure he has your full attention before he says something that cannot be unsaid. He said, "Mr. Marston, your daughter came to me 8 weeks ago. She had just received confirmation from Edmund Greer's primary estate attorney that she was named sole heir to an estate currently valued at approximately $14 million. I made none. I was too busy keeping my face arranged. She was not calling to celebrate." He said it simply, flatly, and then he let it sit there for a full breath before he continued. She was frightened. She believed Joel had discovered the inheritance before she was ready for him to know. She couldn't prove how, but she said his behavior had shifted in ways she could feel before she could document, and she'd overheard a phone call he ended the moment she walked into the room. I said, "What did she want from you?" "Two things. First, documentation confirming the inheritance was structured entirely outside of marital assets. Joel could not touch it in a divorce." I said, "And the second thing?" Harrison Wolf looked at me steadily. He said, "She wanted me to hold a sealed letter, to be opened only in the event of her death, or," he paused, "and these were her exact words, in the event that her father came asking questions." The air in that office changed completely. Raymond put his hand on my arm. I said, "She wrote me a letter." He said, "She did." I said, 8 weeks ago." He said, 8 weeks ago." I looked at him. He looked at me, and in the space between us was the unbearable weight of understanding. My daughter had sat in this very chair, 8 weeks ago, alive and frightened, and thinking about me, and written me a letter she hoped I would never have to read. He slid the envelope across the desk, cream-colored, sealed, my name on the front in Kara's handwriting. Neat, deliberate, nothing like the quick looping way she usually wrote. This was the handwriting of someone choosing every single letter. I picked it up. "Held it," Raymond said, very quietly. "You don't have to read it here." I said, "Yes, I do." And I opened it. "I am not going to read you every word my daughter wrote. Some of it belongs only to me. Some of it is the kind of private tenderness between a father and daughter that has no business being spoken out loud in anyone else's presence. But I will tell you this. Kara wrote that she loved me. She wrote that she understood. About Diana. About Edmund. About the secret. About all of it. And that she had forgiven me completely. She wrote that finding Edmund had not replaced anything. It had only added. Then she wrote about Joel. She had found, buried in a hidden folder on their shared home computer, a series of emails. Between Joel and a man she didn't recognize. The emails discussed Edmund Greer by name. They discussed the inheritance, they discussed timelines, and at the bottom of one email, Joel had written 7 words that my daughter copied into her letter to me word for word. "It needs to happen before the will clears." My hands were shaking by the time I finished, not with grief, with the cold, clarifying fury of a man who finally understood exactly what had happened to his child. I folded the letter, put it in my jacket pocket, pressed my hand flat against it for one moment. Then I looked at Harrison Wolf and said, "How do I get this to the detective handling her case?" He said, "Detective Curtis Vane has already been in contact with my office. He reached out yesterday morning." I said, "Developed how?" "The skid marks at the accident site are inconsistent with weather conditions that night. The brake line on Kara's car has been sent for independent analysis. And Mr. Marsden, Joel Pruitt's phone records show 14 calls to an unregistered number in the 10 days before your daughter died." Raymond's grip on my arm tightened. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, "He thought he was going to inherit $14 million. Harrison said, "That appears to be the working theory." I stood, picked up my jacket, looked at him. "Mr. Wolf, my daughter walked into this office 8 weeks ago and trusted you with the most important thing she had. Is everything she built still solid?" He stood, looked at me without blinking. "Mr. Marston, your daughter was meticulous. Everything she gave me is documented, dated, witnessed, and sealed. Joel Pruitt's name appears nowhere near Edmund Greer's estate, and the letter you are holding, combined with those phone records and the brake line analysis, is going to make a prosecutor's entire career." I nodded. I said, "Good." And I walked out of that office with my daughter's last words against my chest, and 30 years of guilt converting, slowly, completely, irreversibly, into something that felt exactly like purpose. Joel Pruitt was sitting in that house on Delmore Avenue right now, comfortable, certain, pouring himself coffee in my daughter's kitchen, watering none of her herbs, planning how to spend money he was never going to see. He had given me 48 hours. I had given Detective Curtis Vane everything. And tomorrow morning, Sheriff Booker was going to knock on a door. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this community alive and these stories coming. Thank you, for real. I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, not because I couldn't handle what was coming. I didn't sleep because my mind was doing what it always does when it finally has all the pieces, assembling them, running the sequence forward and backward, until every angle was accounted for. Raymond fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight. I covered him with a blanket, and I sat at his kitchen table with Kara's letter in front of me and a cup of coffee that went cold, and I talked to my daughter, not out loud, just in that interior way, the conversation that lives in your chest, the one that doesn't need words because the person you're talking to already knows everything you're trying to say. I said, "I'm going to finish it, baby. Whatever you started, I'm going to finish it." At 6:30, I was dressed. I wore burgundy, Kara's absolute favorite color on me. She used to say, "Dad, you wear burgundy like you own the color." I'd always told her she was being dramatic. I understood it now. I wore it like armor. Raymond woke up at 6:45, walked into the kitchen, looked at me sitting there composed and ready, and said, "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" I said, "I rested." He said, "Peter." I said, "I'm fine. Make coffee." He put the coffee on without another word. That is the gift of a brother who has known you for more than 50 years. He knows when to push and when to simply put the kettle on. We sat together in the quiet early morning, and I told him the plan. When I finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "This doesn't fix what happened." I said, "I know." He said, "Kara is still gone, Peter, even after all of this." My throat closed for a moment. I waited it out. I said, "I know that, Raymond, but she came to me for 30 years in my dreams, and I gave her a story instead of a truth. And when she finally found the truth herself, the truth I buried, it got her killed. But I can make sure that the man who decided her life was worth less than $14 million does not spend a single free morning for the rest of his." Raymond set his mug down. He said, "Then let's go." I called Detective Curtis Vane at 7 a.m. sharp. He answered immediately, the voice of a man already at his desk, already 3 steps into a morning that hadn't officially started yet. He said, "Mr. Marston, I was going to call you at 8. I said, "I saved you an hour. What do you need from me?" A beat. Then something that sounded almost like respect. He said, "The brake line analysis came back this morning. Confirmed. The damage is inconsistent with road wear or impact. Someone interfered with that line deliberately, carefully enough to pass an initial inspection, not carefully enough to pass ours." I gripped the phone. Combined with the phone records, the emails your daughter preserved, and the letter from Mr. Wolf's office. "Mr. Marsden, we have enough. We are moving this morning." I said, "What time?" He said, 8 o'clock. Sheriff Booker will be at the door. I said, "Detective Vane, is there a public street in front of that house on Delmore Avenue?" A pause, shorter than you'd expect from a man who understood exactly what was being asked. Then, "There is. Visibility is excellent from the east side, particularly from a parked vehicle." I said, "Thank you, Detective." He said, "Thank your daughter. She built this case. We just followed what she left us." I had to set the phone down for a moment after that. Just a moment. Then I picked up my jacket, and told Raymond to get his keys. We parked on Delmore Avenue at 7:52. The street was quiet the way residential streets are quiet on weekday mornings. A sprinkler running somewhere. A garage door opening 2 houses down. The ordinary stillness of a neighborhood that doesn't yet know what is about to happen inside it. Kara's house sat at the end of the block. Cream-colored shutters. The back garden invisible from the street, but I knew exactly what was in it. I knew because she'd called me from the garden center the spring she planted it, asking whether she should do tomatoes or peppers. I'd said both. She'd said, "Dad, I only have so much space." I'd said, "Then make more space." She'd planted both. I looked at that house and I thought, she was in there. She lived there. She called me from the back garden there, and she was so completely, thoroughly alive in there. Raymond put his hand on my arm. Neither of us said a word. At 7:58, 2 squad cars turned onto Delmore Avenue from the north. Quiet. No sirens. This was not the kind of arrest that announced itself. This was the kind that arrived like a conclusion. Inevitable, patient, already decided. Detective Curtis Vane stepped out of the lead car, taller than his phone voice suggested, deliberate in his movement. Sheriff Booker came around from the passenger side, broad-shouldered, silver at his temples, the bearing of a man who had done hard things for a long time and made peace with every one of them. They walked up the front path together. Sheriff Booker knocked on the door. Now, I need you to understand what happened in the next 40 seconds, because I have replayed it every single day since, and I will probably replay it for the rest of my life. Nothing happened for the first 15 seconds, just the ordinary silence of a house that doesn't yet know it's over. Then a light came on inside, visible through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Warm yellow. The hallway light. The light Kara always left on because she said dark hallways were depressing. The door opened. Joel Pruitt stood in the doorway in a gray t-shirt, hair slightly disheveled, the comfortable ease of a man who had enjoyed a full night of untroubled sleep. He was holding his phone. He looked at Sheriff Booker. He looked at Detective Vane. And I watched from across that street through Raymond's windshield, in my daughter's favorite color. I watched Joel Pruitt's face move through every stage of a man whose entire constructed reality is collapsing in real time. Confusion first, eyebrows pulling together, the instinctive half-smile of someone defaulting to social pleasantry before the brain catches up. Then recognition, the smile dying midway, eyes sharpening. Then, and this is the part I will never forget, calculation. Even then, even standing in his doorway at 8 in the morning with 2 law enforcement officers on his porch, Joel Pruitt was still running numbers, still looking for the angle, still searching for the version of this he could talk his way out of. That room scan, the handkerchief, the hand on my shoulder 3 times during the service, all of it suddenly assembled into one complete and devastating picture. This was who he had always been. Kara had known it. She had built an entire case knowing it. And she had left it for me to find. Detective Vane said something. I couldn't hear the words, but I watched Joel's hand, the one holding the phone, go completely still. And then Detective Vane said something else, and I saw the word form on Sheriff Booker's lips as he reached for the handcuffs. Murder. Joel Pruitt looked down the front path, past the officers, across the street, and he found me, sitting in the passenger seat of my brother's car, burgundy, both hands folded in my lap, looking directly, completely unflinchingly at him. I want to tell you I felt triumph in that moment. I want to tell you it felt like victory, clean and complete and satisfying the way revenge stories are supposed to end. But that is not what I felt. What I felt was 30 years of a secret that cost my daughter her life, staring back at me through the eyes of the man who had decided to profit from it. What I felt was Kara, in the garden center, asking about tomatoes and peppers and space. What I felt was a father who had lied by omission for 3 decades out of pride and pain, and wound up here, on this street, on this Wednesday morning, watching this happen. And underneath all of that, I felt her, Kara, everywhere, in the cream-colored shutters, and the garden she'd planted, and the labeled herb pots on the kitchen windowsill, and the burgundy I was wearing, and the letter in my jacket pocket, and the case she had built, meticulous, thorough, extraordinary, from inside a life that was terrifying her. She had done all of that, scared, alone, and she had still done all of it, for me, so that I would have something to find. Joel Pruitt's face crumpled, not with remorse, with the devastating, airless realization that he had been outmaneuvered, not by a detective, not by an attorney, not by a system, by a 37-year-old woman with labeled herb pots and white lilies, and a father she loved enough to protect from beyond the grave. Sheriff Booker stepped forward, and Joel Pruitt, in his gray t-shirt, on his front porch on a quiet Wednesday morning, on Delmore Avenue, put his hands behind his back. I looked away. I didn't need to watch the rest. I had seen what I came to see. I looked straight ahead at the empty street. The sprinkler was still running 2 houses down. An ordinary, unhurried morning continued around an extraordinary thing. Raymond said, very quietly, "It's done." I said, "It's done." He said, "What now?" I thought about it. The question underneath the question. Not what now this morning, but what now for the rest of it. The grief still waiting. The guilt that would take years to fully unpack. The 30 years of a secret I would have to learn to carry differently now that its consequences were fully in the open. I said, "I'm going to go back to that house. I'm going to water Kara's herbs, and I'm going to sit in her garden for a while. Raymond nodded. Then I said, and then I'm going to find Edmund Greer. Raymond looked at me. I said, he lost her too. He had 6 months with his daughter, and then she was gone. He is 71 years old, and he is sitting somewhere this morning not knowing that the man who killed her is in handcuffs right now. A long quiet. I said, I kept her from him for 37 years. The least I can do is tell him it's over. Joel Pruitt was charged with first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and tampering with a motor vehicle. His contact, the unregistered number on his phone records, turned out to be a former colleague with a criminal record and a very unfortunate habit of keeping text messages he should have deleted long ago. He cooperated fully within 72 hours in exchange for a reduced charge. Comfortable people make mistakes. Desperate people make worse ones. The $14 million estate passed through probate without a single complication. Harrison Wolfe had made sure of that. Kara had made sure of that. It came to me as her next of kin, the sole heir of a father she found 6 months before she died, and a secret that had kept them apart for 37 years. I didn't keep most of it. Edmund and I met properly for the first time 2 months after Joel's arrest. We sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, and we were two old men who had made an enormous mistake a long time ago and lost something irreplaceable. Because of it, we didn't pretend otherwise. We didn't perform anything for each other's benefit. We just sat there and talked about Kara. For 4 hours we talked about her. He told me about their 6 months together, things I hadn't known, moments I hadn't seen. I told him about 37 years he'd missed. We laughed twice. We cried more than that. Before we left,